In 1992, a nurse at St. Mary's Hospital in Northern California suddenly disappeared without a trace, leaving her parents with no answers for nearly 2 decades. But 19 years later, her father accidentally flipped through her nurse's handbook, and what he discovered in that moment changed everything. The morning fog from the valleys around the Trinity Alps slowly rolled in, covering the mountain town of Willow Creek. Peter Hart stood by his daughter's room window, watching the white mist gradually swallow the road leading to St. Mary's Hospital in the distance. The peacefulness of this small town, with its ancient pine forests and winding streets, had once been a place of solace for him and his wife, until one late summer night in 1992, when their daughter Emily suddenly disappeared without a trace. Peter turned away from the window, his gaze sweeping across the room that had remained just as it was the day Emily left for her late shift at the hospital. The room was a cocoon of time, the wall calendar still frozen in August, the alarm clock stuck at 12:03 a.m. The bookshelf, the floral bedspread, and the box of hairpins lay untouched, as if waiting for her to return. "It's time," he whispered, remembering the conversation with his wife, Clara, the night before. For 19 years they had not changed a thing in this room, but today, after so many years of holding on to hope, they had decided it was time to clear it out, partly because they were moving, but also for one final goodbye. Peter opened the window to let in some fresh air. A cold breeze rushed in, causing the papers on the desk to flutter. He walked over to the wardrobe, starting to pull out familiar items, the nurse's blouse still smelling of laundry detergent, the worn plastic name tag, and the photos she had taken with colleagues in the emergency room. Each item pierced his heart, sharp and real, yet unbearably painful. When he reached the bookshelf, Peter stopped. He had never paid much attention to it, partly because it hurt, partly because he feared what it might reveal. Emily had been a dedicated nurse, often writing notes to improve her knowledge. As he flipped through the books, he found a small leather notebook, one with a soft cover, slightly worn, with creases at the corners. The cover was inscribed with the handwritten words, "Nurse's Handbook, E.H." Peter sat down on the edge of the bed, opening the notebook. The first few pages contained patient lists, shift schedules, treatment notes, all written in neat, calm, cursive handwriting. One page listed, "Patient room 203, Mrs. Sylvia K. Sharp temper but not dangerous. Needs insulin at 6 a.m. Don't forget to tell her about her grandson. She loves hearing about him." The next page, "Room 210, Mr. Jerome H. Always has trouble sleeping. Loves jazz music. Next time, bring him a Miles Davis tape." Some notes made Peter pause. "Today I feel exhausted, but I still feel like I'm doing the right thing. One patient called me an angel just because I held his hand while giving him a shot. It sounds hollow, but I cried afterward. Rachel left her watch in the ER again, the 3rd time this week. I wonder how she manages without me." Peter smiled faintly. The way Emily spoke of her friends and her work was still full of responsibility and humor, just as he remembered her. Near the end of the notebook, the handwriting seemed more hurried, as if written during a short break. "It feels like I'm sinking deeper into work. Not bad. Maybe it's good, because it helps me forget the emptiness I feel when I come home at night." Then Peter spotted a short note, written in blue ink, slightly off to the side as if added later. "Rachel is borrowing my healing journal to refer to, but there are a few notes I haven't written yet. I'll remember to ask Rachel to get it back tomorrow because there are some important things I need to write down." Peter frowned. He had never heard of the healing journal. The name hinted at something more personal than the notebook he was holding. A place where Emily might have poured out her thoughts, emotions, and perhaps things she couldn't share with anyone. And Rachel, her best friend, colleague, someone who had once been as close as family. How long had it been since they last saw her? After Emily's disappearance, Rachel had visited for a while, but those visits had faded, and eventually stopped altogether. Peter closed the notebook, the question swirling in his mind. Does Rachel still have the healing journal? And if so, why had it never been mentioned? The front door creaked open. Clara entered, holding a basket of fresh vegetables from the local market. She stopped in her tracks when she saw the room, the belongings scattered about, the blouse, the books, the photo boxes, and the notebook opened on the table. "Peter, What is all this?" Her voice was soft, but it carried a sorrow that was impossible to hide. Peter stood up. "I'm cleaning out Emily's room, like we talked about last night. But I found something important. A notebook. And it mentions another one, the healing journal. Rachel borrowed it." Clara froze. "Rachel? I haven't seen her in so long. I think she lives in a small town near Stone Pine Lake now." Peter nodded, his eyes still on the notebook. I'm going to visit Rachel. I need to ask if she still has that notebook. Maybe there's something in it we don't know." Clara paused for a moment, then sighed. "It's just, I'm afraid that if there's something in it, it'll hurt even more. After all these years, can we handle reopening it all?" Peter looked at his wife. "I'm not looking for comfort, Clara. I just need to know what happened to our daughter. Whatever the truth is, we've waited long enough." He picked up the notebook, his wallet, and his car keys. Before he left, he glanced back at his daughter's room. It was still as it had been, a museum of memories. Inside him, a small flame flickered, a flame of hope, of urgency, and above all, of love that had never faded. Peter drove along the winding hills shaded by tall pines, heading out of the town of Willow Creek, following the address Clara had given him, the place Rachel had moved to after leaving St. Mary's Hospital many years ago. The trip took about 30 minutes, leading him to a quiet residential area on the edge of the forest, where a few old camper vans and modular homes stood scattered beneath thick tree canopies. The chirping of birds could be heard, and the air was fragrant with the scent of young pine. Peter parked on the side of the road, stepping out and looking around to identify Rachel's vehicle. A man in a short-sleeved shirt was cleaning in front of a silver RV. "Excuse me," Peter called out. "I'm looking for someone named Rachel. She used to be a nurse at St. Mary's Hospital." The man put down his bucket. "Rachel? She lives in the blue camper at the end of the row next to the big pine. She's kind, but a bit reclusive." Peter nodded in thanks, then slowly walked toward the indicated vehicle. It was modest but clean, with a potted lavender plant placed at the front and a faded checkered blanket draped over a folding chair at the side. He took a deep breath and knocked on the door. A moment later, the door swung open. A woman in her 40s stepped out, with dark brown hair falling loosely over her shoulders and a natural, makeup-free face marked by dark circles under her eyes. She eyed him briefly with suspicion, then her gaze slowly softened as she recognized him. "Rachel," Peter said, his voice hoarse with nervousness. "I'm Peter Hart, Emily's father." She stood silently for a few seconds. Surprise flashed across her face, followed by a wave of emotion. "Mr. Hart, oh my God." Rachel exhaled deeply. "Please, come in." The space inside was small, simple, but neat. Several photos were taped to the walls, nurses in uniform, a few nature shots, and a blurry photo of two young women smiling in the hospital break room. "Please sit down. I've made chamomile tea, unless you'd prefer coffee," Rachel offered, her voice shaking slightly. "Chamomile will be fine, thank you." Rachel turned to make the tea, while Peter placed Emily's notebook on the table, gently caressing the cover as though it still held the warmth of his daughter. "You caught me by surprise," Rachel said as she sat down across from him. "It's been so long. Seeing you again brings back everything." Peter nodded. "Last night I found Emily's notebook while cleaning her room. It mentioned something called the healing journal. You borrowed it." Rachel stopped breathing for a moment. Her eyes lowered. She stared at Peter for a long while before standing up and walking to a small drawer under the bed. She rummaged through it for a few minutes, then took out an old brown leather-bound notebook, tied with a cloth string. The cover had a small burn mark at the corner, but the words, "The Healing Journal," were still visible, written in purple ink. "I've kept it," Rachel said, holding the notebook with both hands. "After Emily disappeared, I couldn't bring myself to return it. Part of me wanted to believe she was still out there somewhere, and this notebook is the last thing that still holds her voice." Peter went silent as he took the notebook. The leather cover was soft and worn from time, each page slightly bent as if it had endured long shifts and spilled coffee. As he flipped through it, Emily's handwriting appeared. Still the same neat, cursive style, but this time not in medical notes or instructions, but in longer passages, more personal reflections. Mrs. Greta said today that I remind her of her daughter. I don't know if I should feel happy about it, but her gaze was strangely warm. Sometimes I sit amid the chaotic ER and feel an odd sense of peace. Everyone's alive, but they're also about to lose something. And I just try to keep them here. Peter flipped through a few more pages. There were some photos taped inside, patients laughing, scenes from the hospital, and some small doodles Emily had scrawled in the margins. But then one page stopped him. A black and white photo was taped into the middle of the page. It showed a group of patients in the hospital's backyard. They were sitting on benches or standing around a large tree, most of them blurred by the bright sunlight. But in the center was a young man, about 30, with short black hair and a serious expression. Something about this made Peter's skin crawl. The man's face was circled in red ink. No one else in the photo was marked, only him. Below the photo, Emily had written briefly, "Note, 3rd week of July, therapy group." Peter turned to the next page and found a hastily written note. "The 4th person from the left. I need to keep an eye on him. Sometimes he makes me feel at ease. Sometimes he makes me feel unsafe. Maybe I'm just being overly sensitive, but my gut keeps telling me not to overlook this." Peter handed the notebook to Rachel. "Do you know who this is?" he asked, pointing to the red circle. Rachel glanced at the photo. Her face stiffened. "That's David Walker, a temporary patient undergoing psychiatric treatment. No one paid attention to him, except Emily." Peter remained silent, lightly stroking the page, his gaze fixed on the face in the photo. Not because he knew the man, but because Emily had felt something, enough to mark it. "Would you mind if I kept this notebook for a while?" he asked. "No, not at all," Rachel replied. "But if you read anything strange, please let me know. I never read it all." Peter stood up, clutching the healing journal tightly in his hand. Before he left, Rachel gently grabbed his sleeve. "She was the best person I've ever known. I still feel guilty for not doing more." Peter looked at her. "You were a good friend to Emily. You helped me get this notebook. Maybe the final piece. Thank you." Rachel nodded, her eyes glistening. "If you need anything, just come to me." Peter left the camper, unsure whether he was carrying hope or fear. The evening light filtered through the trees, casting long shadows at his feet. In his hand was his daughter's notebook, containing words that had been silent for nearly 2 decades. He wasn't sure what would be found in the pages. All he knew was that, for the first time in 19 years, he felt like he was touching something Emily hadn't had a chance to tell him. Peter sat silently in the car, the healing journal resting on the passenger seat. His mind was swirling with the images and notes he had just read, especially the photograph of the group of patients with a man circled in red. The name Rachel had mentioned, David Walker, echoed in his mind like a faint bell tolling something still unresolved. It wasn't because the name was unfamiliar, but because for the past 19 years, neither he nor Clara had ever heard Emily mention this person. Peter picked up his phone and dialed Lieutenant Hal Baring, the officer who had been in charge of Emily's disappearance case. The call went straight to voicemail. Of course, it was Sunday afternoon. No surprise there. He looked back at the copy of the photo, the man's face in the center, circled in red, an emotionless gaze, still but dark. Peter gripped the steering wheel, hesitating for a moment. He should have gone home, but instead he drove toward the address in the records Rachel had sent. "Just passing by," he muttered, starting the engine, "just to find out who he is." About 30 minutes later, Peter drove into a rundown neighborhood on the outskirts of town. Gray, one-story buildings with overgrown lawns, a few windows taped shut. The atmosphere here felt thick with isolation. The address led him to a small house, cracked walls and a patchy roof. He turned off the car and observed through the window. On the porch, a broken wooden chair lay tilted. The curtains were drawn tight, but there was movement inside. A shadow passing quickly across the window. The door opened. A man stepped out, tall, thin, with short hair and an unusually sharp gaze. Peter immediately recognized him. David Walker. The face was unmistakable. Even after all this time, it was the same man from the photo. David stopped on the doorstep, his gaze fixed on Peter's car. No surprise, just an appraisal. Peter knew he couldn't sit still any longer. He stepped out of the car, still holding the notebook tightly. "Hello?" he started. "I'm Peter Hart, Emily Hart's father." For a moment, confusion flickered in David's eyes, quickly replaced by a closed-off expression. "I knew her," he said, his voice flat. "She was a nurse at St. Mary's." Peter nodded, keeping his tone calm. "I found some of Emily's notes. She wrote about you. There was a photo. You were the only one circled in red. I just want to ask a few things. Nothing more." David silently took a step down, folding his arms. "I've talked to the police. I'm not involved. Nothing more to say." Peter persisted. "Emily seemed to be a bit concerned about you. You made her feel uneasy. Do you know why?" "No," David responded quickly. "And I don't care. I don't remember much. I'm a patient. I get treatment. She worked. End of story." Peter took a small step back, not out of fear, but to keep the conversation going. "You seem agitated. I'm not here to accuse anyone. I just want to understand." David cut him off, his tone suddenly sharper. "I'm not the person you should be looking for. I'm no longer involved. Why don't you let the past die?" "Because my daughter is dead or missing, and no one has told me the truth," Peter answered, his emotions starting to show. David took a step closer, his eyes beginning to burn with anger. "You want to blame someone? You came here because you need a villain to pin the blame on? Well, go find someone else. I'm not the thing you're hunting." Peter suppressed the anger in his chest. "I'm not hunting anyone. I'm a father, and Emily deserves an answer." David laughed, short, sharp, and devoid of any humor. "What answer? That the world is awful? That good people like her are always the first to disappear? I don't have an answer for you." A charged silence stretched between them. Peter had no more questions, but David's eyes spoke louder than words. There was something, not clear guilt, but a tremor. It was as though he had just tried to push away a haunting thought. David pointed toward the car. "You should leave. Now." Peter didn't say anything else. He turned and walked back to the car, clutching the notebook tightly in his hand. Behind him, the door slammed shut, cutting off all entry. Once in the car, Peter closed his eyes for a few seconds. His heart pounded, not from fear, but from a strange feeling. He had just touched the right place. This feeling didn't need proof. It came from the reaction. A reaction from someone with something to hide. Peter silently drove past the rows of trees lining the road. The evening shadows stretched with every turn of the wheel, and he wondered, had he just unknowingly knocked on a door that should have remained closed? Peter drove back to town in silence. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He tried to convince himself that David's violent reaction had simply been due to being disturbed. Who wouldn't be irritated when their vague past was dragged up, especially a past tied to the hospital and psychological treatment? But deep down, something gnawed at him. It wasn't just because David had been a patient, it was because Emily had written about him with an unsettling caution. And today, David had confirmed he knew Emily. But his reaction was as though he felt threatened. Peter drove slowly through the town center. As he neared the old cemetery, he found himself turning into the parking lot behind it. He didn't intend to go in, but something was pulling him there. If today is the start of the truth, he thought, then maybe it's also time to plan a real memorial for Emily, even if it's just a ceremony without a body. Peter sat in the car for a long while, then decided to get out and walk into the cemetery office. An elderly woman with a warm smile handed him several brochures about memorial services and cremation options. He thanked her, took a few sheets, and turned to leave, still unsure of what he was doing. And then, as if something were guiding him, a movement across the street made him stop. David Walker, he had just come out of a small grocery store, holding a foldable shovel and an old wooden box. Peter froze. David didn't notice him. He casually loaded the items into the trunk of his car, then crossed the street into a small flower shop. A few minutes later, he emerged with a pale pink peony bouquet, Emily's favorite flower. A cold shiver ran down Peter's spine. It could just be a coincidence. Many people like peonies, but a shovel, an old wooden box, and the exact flower his daughter loved? His heart raced. Without hesitation, Peter started the car and silently followed David as he drove out of town, taking the winding road north toward the forest, where small cabins dotted the trees and the morning mist hung in the air. David turned down a dirt road leading to a solitary wooden house at the edge of a hill. Peter didn't stop immediately but drove a few hundred meters further, then circled back and parked behind a cluster of tall ferns. He turned off the engine, locked the door quietly, and got out, keeping his distance as David disappeared behind the pines. David walked, pulling a small cart behind him, carrying the shovel, the wooden box, and the peony bouquet. He turned onto a narrow, almost unused trail, overgrown and covered in dry leaves, leading to a clearing at the top of the hill where he could look down into the valley below. Peter carefully followed, hiding behind trees and bushes, his heart pounding with tension. At the end of the trail, the space opened up into a flat, barren area. There, among the sparse trees, David stopped. There was no gravestone, nothing to mark the place, but he began to dig, slowly, deliberately, at a specific spot as though it had been chosen beforehand. The earth wasn't too hard, but it wasn't a place that had been recently disturbed. When the hole was about half a meter deep, David sat down, opening the wooden box. He pulled out a few sheets of paper. They looked like handwritten letters or a journal, and read them intently. Peter strained his eyes to see, but he couldn't get close enough. He could only make out David's face, no longer cold, but absorbed, as though he was staring into a memory. A gust of wind suddenly blew through, scattering a few sheets of paper from David's hands. He cursed, jumped up, and scrambled to collect them, as though they were gold. Once he had gathered them all, he placed everything back into the box, set the peony bouquet on top, and carefully covered it with dirt, one shovel at a time, slowly and meticulously. He tamped the earth down hard. Then he stood still, silent. Peter held his breath, trying not to move. But when David whispered, his voice just loud enough to be carried on the wind, Peter heard every word. "Now you can rest in peace, Emily." The name sent a jolt through Peter's chest. He staggered back reflexively, his foot catching on a small rock that almost caused him to fall. He quickly grabbed onto a tree trunk to avoid making any noise. David spun around. "Who's there?" he snapped, his voice loud in the evening air. Peter froze, pressing himself back against the tree. David walked toward him, carrying the shovel, his eyes scanning the bushes, just a few meters away from where Peter was hidden. He stopped. A minute felt like a lifetime. Then David shook his head slightly and stepped back. "Probably just the wind," he muttered, but his voice was still tinged with doubt. He gathered his things, then didn't take the same route back. Instead, he looped through the forest, as if to check if anyone was following him. Finally, Peter saw him return to the wooden house, leave the shovel leaning against the porch, and drive away. Peter waited, counting to 120 in his head. Only when he was sure David had gone did he slowly emerge from his hiding spot. His body was trembling from the adrenaline, but his legs still carried him to the newly covered mound of earth. He knelt, his hands shaking as they touched the still damp ground. This was no longer a question. Something was buried here. A memory, a piece of evidence, the truth, and the name of his daughter, Emily, had been spoken right here. Peter looked around. The scene was still and silent, as if no one had been here, but he knew he couldn't turn away again. Peter turned back to the wooden house where David had left the shovel leaning against the wall. He grabbed it and headed back to the freshly filled earth. His hands trembled, but the determination in his eyes never wavered. He began digging. Each shovel was careful yet hasty. The earth was soft, damp, from the water David had poured earlier. Within a few minutes, Peter hit something hard. The peony bouquet buried under the earth still carried a faint scent. He gently pushed it aside, continuing to dig until the shovel clinked against wood. It was the box. Peter bent down, preparing to lift it when, "I knew it! I knew someone was following me!" A voice rang out from behind him. Peter froze and whipped around. David stood a few meters away, his eyes filled with anger and something that almost seemed like despair. "You shouldn't have come back," he said slowly, taking a few steps closer. "What do you think you're doing here?" Peter stood up, still gripping the shovel, now not just a digging tool, but a means of defense. "I heard you mention my daughter's name," Peter said, his voice shaky but firm. "I want to know. What's in that box? What does Emily have to do with this?" David squinted, a bitter smile curling his lips. "Have to do with it?" he repeated. "You don't understand anything." "Did you love her?" Peter asked, almost involuntarily. David fell silent for a few seconds. The wind howled through the rocks. Then he nodded slightly. "Love her?" he whispered. "Yes, I loved her. In a way you'll never understand. She was the only one who made me feel like I wasn't invisible. She wasn't afraid of me. She trusted me." Peter's throat tightened. "If that's the case, why did you do this? Why hide everything?" David shouted, his voice cracking. "Because I wasn't good enough. I didn't deserve her, but I couldn't let go." He took another step forward. "She started pulling away from me. She said I needed help. She said I wasn't okay. She wanted to leave me. And I knew, if I let her go, I'd lose her forever." Peter's voice grew more controlled. "So, what did you do, David? How did you keep Emily? What did you do to my daughter?" David trembled. His eyes were red from holding back tears. "I just wanted her to stay. I didn't mean to hurt her, but then everything got out of control. She started to fear me. I couldn't let her go. She was everything." Peter took a step back. David stepped closer. "You kept her?" Peter asked, his voice barely a whisper. David didn't answer. The silence was the answer. Peter raised the shovel high. "I'll take this to the police." David yelled, losing control. "No, you can't touch it." He lunged forward, yanking the shovel from Peter's hands. The two men staggered between the bushes near the edge of a cliff. Peter struggled to break free, but his age put him at a disadvantage. David shoved him, knocking him to the ground, pinning him, his hands tightening around Peter's neck. "You don't understand anything. You don't know how Emily looked at me. No one does." Peter thrashed, his vision fading. The air seemed to leave his lungs. The sound of a police siren pierced the stillness. Flashing lights of blue and red cut through the trees. A shout rang out. "Let him go! Hands up!" David hesitated and released his grip. Two officers from the patrol car rushed over, quickly restraining him. Peter lay gasping, clutching his neck. A female officer ran over to help him up. "Are you okay?" I'm okay," Peter rasped. He pointed to the dug-up ground and the box, half visible. "It's there. He buried something. And he mentioned my daughter's name, Emily Hart. She went missing in 1992. An older officer furrowed his brow, immediately ordering the scene to be secured. "Her name was Emily Hart? I remember that case. I'll call the detective in charge of the cold case files." Peter nodded, tears welling up uncontrollably. "I think we've just found the first clue after 19 years. A group of police officers quickly cordoned off the scene. When Detective Ramirez arrived, she immediately took the phone call from Peter and handed him a cold towel to wipe the bruised neck that had been pressed and choked during his fall. "You're Peter Hart?" she asked, her voice firm yet calm. "I'm Detective Ramirez. Can you tell me exactly what happened?" Peter nodded and began recounting everything, from finding the nurse's notebook, his meeting with Rachel, the strange details about the patient named David Walker, to following the trail and witnessing David bury the box while whispering Emily's name. "I know I shouldn't have investigated on my own," Peter sighed, "but after 19 years, I couldn't sit still with any lead." Ramirez nodded, her eyes turning serious. "You said he just buried a box?" Peter pointed to the mound of earth he had partially dug up. "Yes, inside there are things he called Emily's memories. I didn't get a chance to open it before David returned." Ramirez signaled to the forensics team waiting nearby. "Proceed with the excavation." The forensics team carefully removed the earth layer by layer. First, they retrieved the peony bouquet, still fresh, its fragrance wafting through the air, gentle but heart-wrenching. Peter closed his eyes for a second. The white peony was Emily's favorite flower. Just beneath it, they uncovered the wooden box. The officers opened the box carefully, as if handling a sacred relic. Inside were a stack of papers, handwritten letters, photographs, some old medical notes, all yellowed with age, a wooden hairpin, the last birthday gift Clara had given to Emily, a small knitted doll, Handmade. Peter stepped back, his voice barely a whisper. My God, he's kept everything all these years. Ramirez put on gloves and began flipping through the documents. These are letters and notes from Emily to someone, she said, skimming the familiar cursive handwriting. Many of the letters are from Emily, but alongside them there are replies, handwritten by David Walker. Peter leaned in, eyes wide. It looks like they had some kind of secret correspondence, Ramirez observed. Emily tried to reach David beyond the scope of her role as a nurse, as if she wanted to save him. Ramirez opened one of the letters, read a few lines silently, and then handed it to Peter. David, I know you're in pain. I don't think anyone has ever asked you honestly if you're okay. If it's easier for you to write, write to me. I'll read every word, and I won't judge. Emily. Peter collapsed onto a tree stump nearby, his hands trembling. She tried to help him. Ramirez continued checking. She flipped through a stack of photos and suddenly stopped, quickly covering some of them. Oh God. Peter frowned. What is it? Ramirez spoke softly, her voice dropping. There are some photos of Emily, but they're not normal photos. She's tied up and her eyes are filled with terror. Peter recoiled, shocked. No way. The background of the photos was simple wooden interiors, identical to the cabin near the cliff that David frequented. Some other photos were taken in the forest, at the very place Peter had been following. Ramirez flipped over the back of the photo. Many had notes written in blue pen, shaky handwriting. One photo had a repeated line scrawled across the back. You are the only thing real. You are the only thing real. Another. If you're not here, the rest of me will die. And then, the final photo. Emily, looking directly into the lens, her face panicked. On the edge of the photo, a scrawled message heavily pressed with pen. I can't take it anymore. She doesn't understand. She wants to leave. I'm sorry. If I don't keep her, I'll disappear. Peter collapsed, hands on his face. His body curled, as though struck by a deadly blow. She tried to help him. And he... Ramirez placed her hand on Peter's shoulder, her eyes misty. I'm so sorry. A forensics officer from a distance ran up, breathless. Detective, we've found signs of disturbance in the soil about 5 meters away, and small bones are starting to show. Ramirez signaled for the area to be sealed off immediately. Peter said nothing more. He simply stood there in the forest, the wind carrying the scent of peonies, as if reminding him of Emily's last memories, the girl who had lived to heal and left because she believed that everyone deserved to be loved. The forensic team quickly expanded the excavation area. Each layer of dry earth mixed with tree roots was carefully and slowly removed with a scalpel. Then pieces of small bones began to emerge, the remains of a young person, lying deep beneath the cold earth, on the edge of a cliff where neither wind nor sea waves could reach. Peter sat motionless on a mossy stone, his hands holding his face, his eyes too dry to shed another tear. Nearby, Detective Ramirez whispered to an officer, "Call Clara Hart. She needs to know this." Peter heard and nodded, wordlessly. And, "Call Rachel Wexler. She was the last one to care for Emily. She has the right to know the truth." About an hour later, Clara arrived. She rushed to Peter, her face pale but her eyes dry, as if the pain had overwhelmed all reactions. Peter stood and embraced his wife. They held each other in silence. No more tears, only the sound of the wind rustling through the pines like a haunting refrain. "They found her," Peter whispered. "After all these years, finally, she's coming home." Not long after, Rachel arrived. Her hair was a mess, and her eyes were swollen from crying the whole way. She slowly approached the makeshift grave, watching the workers dig around the tiny bones before collapsing to the ground, holding her face and sobbing uncontrollably. "Why didn't you tell me, Emily?" she cried, her voice choked. "Why did you think you had to face him alone?" Clara placed a hand on Rachel's shoulder, her voice trembling but gentle. "No one blames you. Emily always believed that people could be saved, but David, he exploited that trust." At that moment, an older man appeared beside Ramirez, his eyes heavy with sorrow. It was Inspector Ron Keller, the officer who had been in charge of Emily Hart's case during the first 2 years of her disappearance. "No one ever thought of David Walker," he said to Ramirez, his voice tinged with regret. "No criminal record, no odd behavior. We focused on Brandon because he was her boyfriend back then. And David, he was just a sad patient." Clara turned to Ramirez, her voice hoarse in her daze. "When it's all over, we want to bring her home. She deserves to rest somewhere that isn't as cold as this." Ramirez nodded, her eyes also red-rimmed. "I promise. Once the examination is complete, we'll hand over all the remains and personal items to the family. It should be within a few days." A week later, the sky over Mornington was unusually clear. The sea breeze was soft like a breath, and the waves gently rolled under the Whitlow Cliff, where Emily's death had been buried for nearly 2 decades. A local fishing fleet and civilian patrol boats slowly drifted across the water, forming a special funeral procession, silent, solemn, and marked by the town's unique stamp. On the leading boat were Peter and Clara Hart, along with Rachel Wexler, Detective Ramirez, and Inspector Keller. The boats behind carried nurses from the old hospital where Emily had worked, high school friends, and a few townspeople who had known her, even if only briefly. The news of David Walker's arrest and the discovery of Emily's remains had spread throughout Mornington. A community that had once been silent, now united to bid farewell to a soul that had rested too long in the shadows. Peter stood at the bow of the boat, holding tightly to a small ivory urn. He and Clara had decided not to bury Emily in a cemetery, not because they didn't want to visit, but because she loved the sea, Clara had whispered. Emily always said the ocean was the only place that made her feel real. Let her go back to it. A local pastor stood in the middle of the boat, his voice rising gently like the wind. "Today, we are here to say goodbye to Emily Hart. For 19 years, her family lived with unanswered questions and unnamed pain. Today, that pain does not vanish, but it is put to rest. We return Emily to the sea, the place that was once a dream and now her eternal home." Clara stepped up beside Peter, her hand gripping his. "She once said," she choked, "if one day she disappeared, she wanted to be scattered over the ocean. Now, she's come home, Emily." Peter opened the urn, and together the couple scattered the ashes onto the sea. The ashes sparkled under the sun, then touched the waves, dissolving into the heart of the ocean, as if there had never been a boundary between land and water. From the surrounding boats, people released white peony branches into the sea, each flower floating, creating a temporary farewell garden in the still waters. Rachel stepped forward. In her hands was a small, old leather-bound notebook, a replica of the nurse's journal Emily had once written in, which Peter had kept and transcribed every page. She bowed her head, placing it on the water. "I'm sorry, Emily," she whispered. "I should have seen it sooner. Goodbye." After a simple memorial service at St. Helena Hospital, where Emily's colleagues finally bid her farewell with white flowers and uncontrollable tears, the sky began to drizzle. The gray clouds moved over the hospital's roof, slow and heavy, just like the atmosphere that lingered here. In a small office behind the administration area, Detective Ramirez sat across from the head nurse, Peter, and several senior nurses. She placed her briefcase on the table and pulled out a thin stack of files. "David has confessed," she said, her voice even and low, as if each word was carefully weighed. Everyone held their breath. A young nurse covered her mouth with her hand. Peter, Emily's closest colleague, clenched his fists, his eyes red. "He says he loved Emily. Not the kind of love that's pure or kind, but a twisted obsession. He thought Emily was the only one who truly understood and cared for him, that she was more gentle with him than anyone else." Ramirez paused for a moment, then continued, "But when a new patient, a young man, came in, Emily treated him just as carefully as she had treated David. He saw her smile, ask him questions, and touch his hand, and he became jealous." She pulled out a few photocopies of photographs from the file, flipping through them only for the investigators to see. "He said he felt betrayed, that Emily was deceiving him, giving him false hope. He began following her, documenting everything. Then he made a plan. Peter stood up, furious. She was just doing her job. Caring for patients was part of a nurse's duty. Ramirez nodded. We know. But in David's mind, everything had twisted long ago. He didn't see Emily as a nurse. He saw her as a woman who had to belong to him. Another nurse sobbed. So, what happened? Ramirez slowly recounted. He lured Emily to an abandoned house he'd used during outpatient treatment. He pretended to ask her to retrieve a gift from an old patient's family. Emily trusted him. She was always like that. He tied her up. He said he needed time, that if she would listen and understand, he would let her go. But when Emily tried to fight back, calling him a sick man, he lost control. She died from a head injury after being slammed into a wall. He kept her body for 2 days before burying her behind the house, along with the photographs he had taken, what he called his memories. And no one spoke. There was nothing left to say. Ramirez lowered her voice, softer now. Emily was a good person, perhaps too good, and the price she paid was not fair. No one should have to suffer that fate just because of their kindness. Peter whispered, his eyes red. I should have noticed. I saw the way he looked at her. But I thought maybe it was just my imagination. Ramirez walked over and placed her hand on Peter's shoulder. You're not the only one who thinks they could have done something, but the truth is, Emily wasn't wrong, and you all are not to blame. She looked around the room, her voice firm. The only fault lies with the one who exploited someone else's kindness to rationalize the evil within himself. Outside the window, the sunset descended over St. Helena Hospital. A place that once marked the beginning for Emily had now become the final spot where people remembered her with tears and sorrow. But in every hallway, in every unfinished nurse's notebook, in the eyes of her colleagues and former patients, Emily still lingered, not as a victim, but as someone who chose to love, even in a world where not everyone deserved it.